Welcome to today's podcast with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a visionary biologist, celebrated author, and pioneer in exploring the mysteries of life and consciousness. Dr. Sheldrake challenges the conventional scientific dogmas with groundbreaking ideas like morphic resonance, inviting us to rethink the nature of reality and our place in the universe. His transformative work has sparked global conversations, blending rigorous research with bold inquiry. Get ready to dive deep into the realms of science, spirit, and everything in between as we explore the mind expanding ideas of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Dr. Sheldrake, it's such an honor having you on the show. Thank you for your time.
A pleasure to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, I've been a follower of your work for a very long period of time, and I will explain a little later how that came to fruition. But uh, at the moment, I'm more interested in your the way you see science different from scientism. Now, historically speaking, we know that the philosophers they were more interested in self, even the mechanistic processes of the universe. The pendulum of philosophy has been swinging throughout. That's fair enough. And religion has been mostly about the morality and ethics and community building and social building, altruism and so forth. And scientists, even though in 1830s the word itself came about, but before that the natural philosophers, or what we now call the philosophers, they were more interested in how things work in the universe and in the phenomena. But as we hit the age of enlightenment and from there onwards, science has become from the process of discovery to more of a worldview. What, in your opinion, what might be the factors that cause this paradigm shift?
Well, I think to understand it, one has to understand European history. And underlying European history has been the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the 17th century when science got going. Modern science really started in the 17th century, with people like Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. And this was a time when Europe was riven with fights between Catholic and Protestant religious disputes. And one of the ways that scientists managed to promote their endeavor was to say that instead of quarreling about the interpretation of the Bible by priests and clerics and scholars, they were simply going to the source of all nature itself, namely the mind of God. And they thought of God as being a mathematician. It's a very flattering idea for mathematicians. Um, and they thought that the so-called laws of nature they were exploring were the uh, truth about nature, and that they had a kind of hotline to God. So there was a kind of religious motive behind it. And to start with, in the 17th century, um, they made a kind of division. Descartes made his famous split between matter and spirit, or matter and consciousness. And so the idea was that science would get the whole of nature, the universe, human body, animals, plants, the whole of nature would become the province of science, but nature was conceived of as inanimate and mechanical, functioning automatically. Meanwhile, religion would get consciousness, um, God, angels, morality, community building, and so forth. This split was not the case in Europe in the Middle Ages. Before the 17th century, the philosophy of philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas integrated God and nature, and there was no split between technology, science, and religion, as evidenced by the great cathedrals of Europe. If you look at Chartres Cathedral or Notre Dame or Lincoln Cathedral in England, these were built in, around 1200, 1300 AD, involving the most advanced building techniques, stained glass techniques, and so forth, to the glory of God. And there was a kind of fusion or connection. Now, that was split apart in the 17th century in this dualistic split between science and religion, nature and God. And then in the 19th century in Europe, there were a lot of people who thought that having two different principles was too many. Um, and so they wanted to get rid of either spirit or matter. So one school of thought became idealist philosophers, said consciousness is all there is, matter's a kind of dumbed down mind. Um, where the other school, which became predominant and the basis of scientism, were the materialists, who said the only reality is matter, God and angels simply don't exist, and human consciousness is nothing but a product of the physical activity of the brain. And that gave us the philosophy of materialism in its 19th century form, which rapidly acquired dominance within the sciences in Europe. And that really has led to scientism. And because materialism, for political reasons in Europe, was associated with communism and socialism, which were trying to overthrow the old regime, which was linked to religion, um, being atheistic was a very good way of getting rid of, the powers that be in France and then later in Russia. So atheism and materialism, the belief in science as a progressive force, religion as a regressive, backward force, this kind of rhetoric became very important in Europe and has remained so, and is really the reason why there's such a high level of atheism and secularism within European countries.
Okay, well that's remarkable, and it's quite extraordinary how the approach that, I mean, there were different areas being governed by different disciplines, and then even when we go to things such as religion, you mentioned that even though as this sub branch of it, if you like, there were people who were religious people, but at the same time they were examining the phenomena, and they were doing what we call science now. I mean, there wasn't, the word wasn't around there, but it certainly was a scientific enterprise. Um, Now, but if we go slightly back, and sorry, I was talking about something else, but an important thought came to mind, and I don't want to lose it. Um, Now, we say the modern philosophy, Rene Descartes, and that's absolutely fine. But some people also link it back to Copernicus, that because he's been able to prove the much of the Greek work, he was able to prove that wrong, that it's not the Earth which is the center of the universe, and it's not the case that the sun revolves. So, from him, um, shift from a geocentric to heliocentric model. Some people believe that the actual rebellion against the church started from that view, from that moment onwards, on the basis that if the church has got this wrong, because mind you, church at that time was what the guardian of philosophy and religion and science and everything. Um, and the idea was that, well, if the church has got this wrong, then what else there might be wrong about? And a departure commenced from that viewpoint, which was then um, it was uh, Rene Descartes. He actually take it to a much wider level, and then along the way, you had different ideas that either fully or implicitly supported that view. For example, the difference between the phenomenal world and noumenal world of Immanuel Kant, or the logical positivism of 1920s. Those were the things they sort of carried the same message forward. Is that something you'd agree to?
Yes, I think so. Although, when one thinks about the view that Copernicus overthrew the Ptolemaic system with the Earth at the center, although this was taught in universities in Europe and universities were run by the church, it's not a biblical doctrine. It's a doctrine that came from ancient Greek philosophy. It was really what happened in both the Arab world and the Christian world was that the teaching of ancient Greek philosophy was accepted and built into a kind of theological view. Um, but this, so really what was overthrown uh, by Copernicus was one view from Greek philosophy, namely the earth centered view, with another view, which also came from Greek philosophy, the sun centered view, which was first put forward by Aristarchus of Samos in ancient Greece, who was a Pythagorean. And so within ancient Greece, there was a discussion about whether the earth or the sun was at the center. So, really, it was a dispute about cosmology and philosophy that carried over from ancient Greece. It really didn't have very much to do with Christianity, um, but implicitly it did because uh, at that time, the church ran the schools and the universities and the educational system, and it could be seen as a threat to the established order. It was seen as a threat to the established order. But we have to remember that this dynamic doesn't affect all of Christianity. This was a dispute within Western Roman Catholic spirituality. Copernicus was, and the disputes with Galileo were to do with the Roman Inquisition and the Roman Catholic Church. There are large parts of Christianity, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, that were completely out of this debate. They simply weren't part of it at all. They just went on doing their own thing. So it's a particular branch of Christianity that these dynamics occur within.
Okay, well that's great. Now, moving from the dualist approach by Descartes, and along the way it's been supported by different other philosophies. We mentioned the bifurcation between the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm and so forth. But as you said, that in the age of enlightenment, it appeared to be too much to have two different views, and they tried to codify or put everything together, and that's when the scientific materialism at that time it became victorious, and probably it did because it has a lot to show for so far as the technology that it produced and way it changed many of the Asian practices and the advancements in medicine and so forth. But when the view changed and we had things such as the Vienna Circle, they became very much clear that if the metaphysical, they would call them assertions. So by default, we call them assertions. This was their view. And if then we will see if they can be verified through observation or science. And if they fail, then basically they are meaningless. Now, my problem with that is that even though this was a huge step forward towards scientism, or it certainly was supporting it, but here is the problem. When we say that if an assertion is, if we can verify it, so the standard now is verification, and what we are seeing is whether it's a metaphysical assertion or something real that can be trusted. Now, the standard there is that it has to be verified through observation and science. But what is the standard of verification itself? I.e., along the way, I will have to place my faith in my ability, figure out that I am doing justice to this application of verification test, and I have got it right, and I have reached the right result. Similarly, I have to place faith in my ability that I have figured out the science in a correct manner, and I am holding the view that the science by default, whatever the science at that time was, it is absolutely true, and that there is no possibility of it changing, updating, a theory proving wrong. I mean, I am doing a metaphysical exercise here. So how exactly can I refute metaphysics by doing metaphysics? I'm not sure if I've been able to explain myself fully, but it is something certainly that confuses me.
Well, the point about the Vienna Circle and these verificationists was that they weren't scientists. And, I think one can take too seriously philosophers of science. Most scientists know nothing about philosophy, which is a shame, but it's also a fact. Here in Britain, if you're educated as a scientist, you choose science at school at the age of 15 to do A levels to get into university to do science. And there's no philosophy in the curriculum before age 15. So most graduates in science, at least from Britain, have no knowledge whatever of philosophy and no education in it. And so they ignore not only ordinary philosophy, but philosophy of science. And they usually know very little about it. So I don't think it actually had much influence on science. It certainly had an influence on scientism and dogmatic atheism and materialism. But science itself, I think, more or less ignored those points. And of course, science itself, as I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, Science Set Free, which we may discuss later, is itself founded on a whole series of dogmas which are themselves unverified and indeed unverifiable in some cases. So it's not as if scientists actually took very seriously this view, because it didn't, because it would undermine the foundations of scientism itself if they did.
Okay, that's wonderful. Um, okay, I will come back to the logical positivism or the Vienna Circle later because I want to link that with how it was upended by this cultural shift towards the postmodernism. And if that is all about skepticism, then why scientific dogma still remained? I mean, they should have been subject to skepticism as well, but somehow they aren't. And we've seen in coronavirus how everything became trust the science, which is an extraordinary statement to make. What does that even mean? But for now, um, I would like to pick your brain on something very interesting. You mentioned that uh, people who that's when you were commenting on conscience, that the conscience is the product of the physical activity of the brain. Well, it it almost seems like we are trying to put the horse, the cart before the horse here. That what is conscience? And for me to be able to make this statement that there has to be a physical activity in the brain that gives rise to my conscience. So what I'm saying is that I'm consciously observing that this is how it happens. But if the conscience is to be a product of that physical activity, then how exactly do I know that the physical activity is producing my conscience? Because conscience materializes afterwards. So it's the more I look into it, more I read, more confusing it becomes. That what am I trying to say is that I am using a product of a process, and I'm saying that this process gave rise to this product, whereas I need that product to analyze that this product is this process is exactly what it's doing what it claims to do, i.e., producing conscience. I can't make sense of it. Can you?
Well, no, and that's why it's called the hard problem in the philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. For the last 50 years or more, materialist philosophers in the West have been trying to explain away consciousness, saying it doesn't really exist because the whole of reality is material. Materialism says all of the universe is made up of nothing but unconscious matter. Now, if that's true, then how come we're conscious? So we ought not to be if our brains are just unconscious matter. So materialist philosophers have the problem of explaining away consciousness. One school of thought says it's an epiphenomenon, it doesn't do anything, it's just produced by the brain like a kind of pointless secretion or like a shadow or something, doesn't do anything. Another school of thought say it's just a trick of language, it's just another way of talking about the brain. And probably the dominant school at the moment say that consciousness is a kind of illusion produced by the brain. But then the critics of that point of view point out that illusion is itself a mode of consciousness.
Exactly.
So you can't explain consciousness as an illusion without presupposing consciousness. So these attempts to get rid of consciousness lead to all sorts of paradoxes, confusions, and contradictions, which is why the very existence of human consciousness is called the hard problem
Yeah.
in the philosophy of mind. I think it's an inevitable hard problem for any materialist philosophy. And as you know, one way that at the moment the fashion, at least in Britain and the United States, is to go over to a kind of panpsychism to try and dissolve the hard problem by saying, well, there's a little bit of consciousness even in atoms and electrons. So by the time you get to brains, a higher level of consciousness can emerge. It's not different in kind, it's different in degree. So now that's a very interesting move, the fact that some materialists have now become panpsychists, because they're now admitting that consciousness might be much more widespread in nature than in brains. And this has opened up a whole new chapter in this debate that's moving us on beyond old style reductive materialism.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because the whole idea of physicalism is that you deny something which is non-material, but all of a sudden, if you, I mean, not being able to prove that the conscience doesn't exist in a particular human, from there to a shift that, well, everything is part of the same conscience, that's a huge leap. Um, now, it's as interesting as it is, and the question I'm about to ask, you will have to forgive me because that I'm not terribly well versed in that, because I read a couple of articles, try to make sense. It didn't, so I just moved on. And that is an idea that the map of our universe, that is whatever amount of universe is known, it it actually resembles the map of our brain. Now, can it not give some kind of edge to the people who believe that the conscience is indeed an emanation from brain? That if we have this um, conscience across the board idea, and brain giving rise to conscience according to them, and everything has conscience, the universe looks like a brain. Am I reading far too much into it, or maybe there is some kind of hypothesis we can derive from it?
Well, it again, it comes back to this debate about panpsychism. There are some philosophers who call themselves cosmo-panpsychists or cosmopsychists, who would say the whole universe is conscious, um, and that the cosmic network of these plasma threads linking galaxies together, making them look like axons of nerve cells and brain-like, um, uh, is indeed analogous to the brain. It still leaves the question of the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical processes unsolved. Um, but it certainly puts it in a wider context if people take a kind of panpsychist view of the whole cosmos. The interesting thing you see here is that these discussions are taking us beyond narrow, limited, old style materialism. And as they move towards a kind of panpsychist view, we get much more in the territory of traditional philosophy, um, uh, even within even within touch of traditional theologies, because traditional theologies in almost all cultures have taken the view that consciousness comes first, that consciousness underlies all reality, divine consciousness. Um, and then they have to try and explain how divine consciousness is manifested through the natural world. So I think there's a new area of potential dialogue opening up here. Um, but what's interesting is that materialists themselves are no longer, it's hard to find old style dogmatic materialists anymore who just say it's nothing but the brain and so on. They're aware that there's a problem. The fact, at least in Britain and the United States and in Europe, they're aware there's a problem. Old style materialism just doesn't work anymore because the hard problem is intractable
Yeah.
and human consciousness isn't going to go away. So this is really the rock on which the whole ship of materialism is being wrecked at the moment. The fact that we're conscious, and this, of course, is beginning to uh, throw up many more questions about dogmatic materialism or scientism within the sciences and philosophy themselves. This is not a debate in which theologians have been playing much part. This is not outsiders from the scientific and philosophical world wading in and trying to, it's within the scientific and philosophical world that this debate is happening.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I think the human conscience can't go away, because how many times can one attempt to make a conscience statement that the conscience doesn't exist? It has a very limited shelf life. All right, the dogmas that you talk about, science set free, and the science delusion. Now, very clearly, the whole book is structured to make a point that the science has become a worldview, a religion, dogma, basically, that people presume things. And then, I mean, it's nothing like the good old science where you follow the evidence and then you reach the conclusion based on that investigation. It's more of a case of you have the preconceived ideas, and then the rest of the investigation is done just to justify them, or just to sort of fly under those presumptions and make sure that you don't go beyond. Um, it doesn't look like science at all, does it?
Not really. I mean, the science, the ideology of science is that it's about free inquiry, fearless inquiry into the nature of nature by experiment and critical thinking. The reality is that for most scientists, it's a trust in authority and accepting on blind faith what you're taught. In fact, the very thing that atheist propagandists say about religion, that it's dogmatic and based on blind faith, is unfortunately all too true of scientism itself. Most people I meet who are committed atheists and scientists and materialists actually know almost nothing about science. And if you actually, they just accept on blind faith what people like Richard Dawkins or popularizers of science like Brian Cox tell them, or articles they read in newspapers by science correspondents. Um, they're not in a position to question it. To question any of it, they'd need to have a science degree. And if you do have a science degree, I mean, I've got a PhD from Cambridge, I question some of it. Um, and it doesn't mean that everyone says, oh, that's a wonderful thing to question this. There's often a very angry reaction against any kind of questioning
Yeah.
because of this kind of dogmatic faith. And it's become for militant atheists, and there are quite a number of them here in Britain still, they're a dying race, I think. And Richard Dawkins is the best example, but this kind of strident atheism is going out of fashion here quite fast. But for those who are in this militant atheist camp, it's kind of evangelical. They don't just have a personal opinion, um, but they want to convert other people to it. It's a kind of proselytizing quasi religion.
Mm.
Um, and based on dogma, lack of free thinking, and on people accepting on blind faith that science has got it right, despite the rhetoric that it's all about free thinking. And so it's a paradoxical situation. And in some ways, you see, I think that the sciences within this scientistic framework are more dogmatic than religions, because in any religion you have different kinds. So within Christianity, you have Catholics, Protestants, you have Orthodox, you have Methodists. Or within Islam, you have Sunnis and Shias, and you have all different schools of Sufis. And within Hinduism, there's numerous uh, cults and systems and beliefs and so forth. Whereas within science, there's the idea of a kind of single dominant authority the whole world over. The same kind of science is taught in Pakistan and India and China and South America and Europe and North America and so on. Um, so, in a way, it's more dogmatic at any given time because it's not pluralistic. Whereas religion's pluralistic, politics is pluralistic, courts of law are pluralistic in the sense you hear the arguments for and against, prosecution and defense. But within the culture of science, there's a much more dogmatic atmosphere. And scientists are used to this kind of dogmatism, at the same time flattering themselves that they've uniquely risen above it. It's a paradoxical situation.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think there is one particular area within the whole paradigm where that arrogance and inflexibility is seen at its peak, and that is evolution and the Darwinian rendition, and particularly. Now, people believe evolution to be absolutely true, or people believe it to be partially true, or people can believe it to be completely untrue, so long as there is enough reasoning and there is enough science behind that. All views are respected. But what I have seen is that when it comes to Darwinian evolution, people are so angry and rude and arrogant that they can't even. I mean, for someone to say that I have a question on this, I think that's a perfectly reasonable practice and tradition in science, that you ask questions. But more often than not, the questioner is met with contempt and ridicule and harshness, and that is same across the board, right from people like Dr. Richard Dawkins all the way to anyone who's just started becoming evolutionist. And I get to see that a lot in my part of the world, where it's exactly the same thing. And ask, what happened to science? We just have questions. Um, but okay, that's well documented. It's well evident that this is how they behave. But your idea of morphic resonance, now, because we are talking about different biological organisms, that is, us, the humans, and we have different other species, and uh, your theory posits that we have some kind of connection that connects us, and you've given the examples of rats, for example, if they became aware or more educated or about anything in one part of the world, and that behavior was seen in a different world, different part of the world as well in the same species. So there is some kind of connectivity you see there. Have you received any type of pushback from proponents of Darwinism? And if yes, was it science based or was it their trademark behavior?
Well, I'm afraid it's the trademark behaviour. Contemptuous dismissal of anything that goes against the dogma. Um, I mean, the interesting thing you see is that my ideas on the morphic resonance is really a collective memory. And I think that inheritance involves a collective memory as well as genes. Um, and when I first put these ideas forward in the 1980s, in my first book was called A New Science of Life. Um, and when I first put these ideas forward, there was a huge pushback because people said, genes explain everything. The inheritance of genes in Neo Darwinism explains all inheritance. And if what you're saying is true, then there would be an inheritance of acquired characters. Animals and plants could inherit adaptations or forms of behavior from others in the past. And this would uh, lead to a totally different kind of evolution, not just blind chance and natural selection. So there was a tremendous pushback. However, around the year 2000, it became recognized that there really is an inheritance of acquired characteristics, that animals and plants can inherit adaptations acquired by their parents. And it's been rebranded epigenetic inheritance.
Yeah.
The inheritance of acquired characters was the principal heresy in 20th century biology. However, it's not a heresy anymore because of this rebranding. And it's now widely accepted that genes only account for part of inheritance. The Human Genome Project has revealed that in many cases, up to 80% of inheritance of characteristics like height or proneness to diseases is not explained by genes. And this is now called the missing heritability problem. Um, and the epigenetic inheritance is now a hot topic in biological research. And this, in turn, has led to a new view of evolution, which is rapidly gaining credibility, called the extended evolutionary synthesis. The leading proponent of this in Britain is Professor Dennis Noble at Oxford.
Yeah.
Um, and the extended evolutionary synthesis is saying, yes, evolution does happen, and genes play a part in it. They're important for the inheritance of proteins and the protein structure of protein molecules. But also, experience of ancestors' epigenetic inheritance plays a part. And I myself think that this extended evolutionary synthesis could also include morphic resonance as part of the evolutionary process, which means collective memory, collective experience, the transmission of learning, creativity within organisms. You see, the neo Darwinian view says there's no creativity in life at all, it's just blind chance.
Yeah.
Whereas we know there's creativity in organisms in the way that animals and plants adapt to their surroundings and environment. And with the extended evolutionary synthesis, that creativity can become part of the evolutionary process. It's not just blind chance and blind mechanisms. There's a creativity in life. All things can respond creatively to their conditions, and this creativity can affect evolution, which gives us a very different view of the evolutionary process. And so I think the interesting thing is you see that these dogmatic scientistic materialists are simply out of date scientifically. I was at a debate in a festival of ideas in Britain a couple of years ago when Professor Dennis Noble had a debate with Professor Richard Dawkins, and it was perfectly clear that Dawkins was totally out of his depth in this new world, the realm of, of epigenetic inheritance. He didn't know about it. He was sort of 20 or 30 years out of date in his science, and he was just reiterating the same things he was saying in the 1970s and 80s. So I think that one of the main points about these dogmatic materialists is they're simply not up to date with what's happening in science.
I'm so glad that you said it. I've actually had a pleasure of talking to Dr. Dennis Noble in a podcast only a few days ago. And then we had another podcast that was actually a debate review, the debate that you referred to between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble. And I've said almost everything that you just said, only in a much less eloquent way. And it's absolutely true that they are stuck in past, and it's not just that they're just stuck in past. It's they're not even willing to move on, and that's the dogma that you're talking about. The entire book you've written 10 of them, that this is how it is doing a disservice to science and inevitably disservice to our children because they get to learn science from these very people, and the scientific establishment is stuck, not willing to move on. Um, okay, again jumping a topic because you said something which caught my attention, and I want to relate it to a previous point we made. Morphic resonance. When we say that it's about collective memory, and now with the panpsychism as it is a developing theory and it's catching on, and we realize that conscience and memory, they are not strictly speaking same things. But do you see any resemblance that, I mean, could it go this way that if panpsychism is true, if you're all part of collective conscience, then it is much easier to explain that there could indeed be a collective memory too.
Well, I think panpsychism and collective memory fit quite well together. Um, and, collective memory, well, it's not just collective memory that morphic resonance helps explain, it's individual memory. Collective memory and individual memory, I think, differ from each other in degree. I think both of them depend on a kind of resonance from the past across space and time. And you see, one of the dogmas I discuss in my book, as you know, is the dogma that memories are stored in the brain. Now, most people just take it for granted, even people who are not scientists. They just assume the memories are stored inside the head. Sometimes they just say, it's in my head. Um, well, this is a materialist assumption. Materialism assumes that everything's matter or physical, and therefore memories must be material, therefore they must be stored inside the brain. Well, people have been looking for memories inside the brain for over 100 years. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent on this quest, and they haven't found them. And I think the reason they haven't found them is because they're not there. Um, I think the brain is more like a TV receiver tuning in to invisible transmissions from the past, um, rather than like a video recorder storing everything within itself. Um, and so you see, this again is a disputed area in science. People very dogmatically assume that memories are in the brain. And one reason materialists and scientism, people believers in scientism, believe it, is because it fits very well with their atheist worldview.
Yeah.
They don't have evidence that the memories are stored in the brain, it's just an assumption. But you see, from them, from the atheist point of view, it's a useful assumption because if your memories are in your brain, when you die, obviously all your memories will be wiped out.
Sure.
Therefore, any religious theories of an afterlife, whether it's heaven, hell, paradise, purgatory, reincarnation, any theories of an afterlife require a survival of memory of some kind. Because if you don't remember who you are or what you've done, judgment or survival would be quite meaningless without memory. So, by assuming memories in the brain, and given the fact that brains decay after death, then materialists have a very strong atheist argument to attack religions with. But it's not as if they're basing this argument on 100 years of solid science that's revealed overwhelming evidence for memory traces in the brain. They're basing it on a pure assumption that's been extraordinarily unsuccessful scientifically. So again, we're in an area where they're relying on dogma in the name of science, which actually goes against the scientific evidence.
That's very true. And um, the so far as the dogma is concerned, obviously we established that this is not something which is science based. It just happens, and it just goes from one generation to the next through the textbooks, and new generation of children, they go into the laboratories, and by that time their mindset is developed, the dogma is already pre-installed, and that's how that goes. Now, I have a little hypothesis of my own, which I would like to develop into a proper theory at some point in my life. I believe in, I mean, the hypothesis goes something like this, that the human brain is a receptor. It catches whatever is in the air, and then the rest of the body acts based on that. So, why do I think that is the case? Well, I've observed the behavior of small children across different cultures, across different times, and this is what it returns. That when there was a time when, because of the lack of networks and internet and so forth, the knowledge was much more resident at a particular local place. It wasn't traveling across very quickly. The children who were born in those times, how would they behave immediately after the birth? And from immediately after the birth through several days. And across the board, Dr. Sheldrake, there is one behavior: lethargic, not moving about a lot, very slow, lazy. Many of them would open the eyes for the first time after many days of birth and so forth. But now, in the age of internet and it's a lot of information which has been flowing around here and there, we see children who are born. Within few hours of their birth, they become very active. They look around and they are trying to learn things, trying to recognize things very quickly. And what is really interesting is that the wherever the scientific advancement has not reached yet, in those places, babies are still behaving the same way as the babies used to do many decades ago. So what does that tell us? Now, I like to think that the reason wherever we have more information and the traveling of information has made more possible, that the human brain immediately after the birth, I mean, all this traveling of knowledge, that becomes our collective wisdom, and it finds its space in the environment. And immediately after the birth, the baby, the brain receptor, it starts catching on that, which gives them a lot of, it makes them active. It gives them the idea to learn things very quickly. And wherever we don't have that much of knowledge in the collective wisdom in the environment, the babies don't have much to catch. Therefore, they don't. I might be 100% wrong on that. I'm open to it. But this is what I've observed so far. And it's not even a theory, it's an hypothesis. But it's something I like to work on. And I think it actually goes, it finds some resemblance with morphic resonance and finds some resemblance with the epigenetics that you mentioned. I mean, epigenetics we're talking about from one generation to the other, but what if with the inclusion of panpsychism and morphic resonance, and say that we create a knowledge base, so to speak, in the environment, and the newly arriving kids, they subscribe to that very quickly, and that gives them a different behavior in a few days after. Um, I don't know if I can articulate it in any better way at this stage, but it's certainly something which I'm interested in, and maybe sometime in future I'll look into it. But right now, the point you're making about the memory, that somehow materialist view is that it's stored in brain, and that's that. There's lots and lots of scientific experiments actually refuting that. The one I used to teach many years ago was about a mouse who was placed in a maze, and he was given several runs, and he was made to memorize his path. So he would run across from one side to the other, and he would know exactly where to take left and right and straight and so forth. And once that pathway was completely memorized, they removed the maze and see without the maze whether this mouse can run the same path. And the mouse did. But then they removed some of his brain cells that were believed to be containing memory. But remarkably, the mouse ran in exactly the same code, didn't change anything, didn't get confused, it followed the same pathway. And then they deleted a bit more memory, a bit more, and finally, they completely deleted the memory, what they presumed the brain cells containing memory. And in the end, the mouse was still running on the same path, no difference whatsoever. So, I mean, we used to teach this to explain the muscle memory with other examples that how you learn to learn the bicycle once, and even if you lose your memory completely, you still know how to ride bicycle, or you know how to eat. That is your hand that goes to your mouth, and if you lose your memory completely, you don't recognize your family members anymore. But still, even after that, you don't try to put your food into your air or nose. It is still there. So that some kind of memory is always there. So I think that point is very easy to be explained, and it doesn't take any rocket scientist to understand that no, memory is not limited to your brain. But still, when it comes to our beloved materialists, they're not having any of it, are they?
No, well, there's many examples like that that show that removing bits of the brain doesn't destroy memory. I mean, they did these experiments to try and prove where the memory traces were, and it's one of the examples of the failure of this research. Of course, it's true that damage to the brain can affect memory. You know, if you have concussion or a bullet wound or a stroke,
Yeah.
it can affect memory. But that doesn't prove that the memories are stored in the damaged region, because if I came and damaged your TV set, you know, I might affect the sound production or the colors or the pictures, but that wouldn't prove that all the sounds and the colors and the pictures originated inside the TV set, that they were stored there. It would merely show that part of the set was necessary for their reception or processing. And I think the same is true of the brain. We certainly need our brains for various functions, but um, the evidence that memory is stored in them is surprisingly weak. And actually, I don't know if you've come across one of the latest pieces of research, which is where they trained mice to um, run a maze, the same kind of work you're talking about. But they now have very fine microelectrode arrays in their brain, and they were able to find the pattern of electrical activity in the brain. When they were running it, there were particular patterns of waves in the brain. And when they ran it again, they got the same patterns of waves. And they thought, well, that proves that there's the memory, and we can see the wave patterns. But when they actually looked in detail about where the wave patterns were, they weren't in exactly the same part of the brain. What was important was the resonant pattern of waves, but they could move around the brain rather than being fixed in particular cells by material traces. This is now known as representational drift. And it's the latest attempt to try and find localized memories. And yet again, they've proved elusive. And I think representational drift is particularly interesting because what it shows is that it's the wave or resonant patterns which are important, which is what I think is important from the point of view of morphic resonance. It's wave patterns that are important, not physical structures, modified synapses, or memory traces inside the brain.
That's fascinating. No, no, I'm not aware of this study, but certainly I will look into it. So there you go. There's another piece of evidence. But I think it's more of a behavioral problem with not even behavior, it's more of an attitude problem, not even behavior, for our materialists that they don't want to move on. Now, would like to ask you, and we are coming towards the end now, that how will this all end? I mean, obviously, the current um, establishment in science can't keep it going like this because it becoming more and more angry, less tolerant, and any behavior like this, it has a very tight shelf life, and the outright denial of things, even in the existence of despite the existence of evidence. I mean, that it can't be science. Just to explain my point, just in case if somebody thinks that maybe I'm just being unfair here, there's a interview of Richard Dawkins and Dr. Brian Greene. It's available on social media, where Brian Greene asks him that, what if God exists? I mean, this is not verbatim, but this is what the meaning of the conversation was, of the question was. What if God exists? Then what? And Richard Dawkins said, well, if God exists in a way that undermines our scientific enterprise, then I would not believe God. I mean, again, this is not the verbatim, but this is what he meant. And I was wondering that, look, if God exists for any atheist, then it would be absolutely true that God exists. And you are willing to deny an ultimate truth, absolute truth, only because it undermines your scientific enterprise? That is not scientific behavior at all. It's not scientific temperament. It's not. So, with this sort of behavior, how far do you see all this going, and when do you see it can probably be wrapped up, and we will be ushered into a new dawn of science, which is much more tolerant and reason based?
Well, I wish I knew the answer, Keza. I think that the part of the problem, which you've already pointed out, is that the educational system is educating our children in sort of old style materialistic science in schools and universities. There's a huge inertia built into the educational system, even if leading scientists move on beyond materialism, as I believe many are doing already. Um, uh, the educational system may take decades to change, under the present system. So it'll be producing people who've been indoctrinated with this belief system, for years to come, who've been taught that it's true, and all the prestige of science, smartphones, jet planes, all these kinds of things seem to lend credibility to it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one problem. Um, Another problem is the inertia within the scientific world of, the peer review system is highly conservative. It means that the present system is set up to reward incremental improvements along existing lines, and the funding system is set up to reward incremental improvements. So many people are worried, including in government think tanks, that science has become less innovative, less disruptive. There's very few true breakthroughs happening anymore, despite ever more money and effort being spent on the scientific endeavor. So I think part of it, the problem is well, part of the solution would, I think, come from a realization by governments and funding bodies that the present system isn't working very well. It's not really delivering on high level innovation and really new things. Um, Most of what we're experiencing at the moment is based on 20th century science, which has been improved incrementally. The internet, telephones, radio, television, jet planes, all these things were invented in the 20th century. I think the one really true modern invention that's making a difference is artificial intelligence. Um, but it's hard to think of in other areas of science, except perhaps within material science and solid state physics. There are real innovative breakthroughs happening, but they're empirically led, not theoretically led. And that's what's so interesting there, that I think that the materialist science is somewhat stuck theoretically. So I think there'll be a scientific revolution before too long. I mean, my own efforts are directed towards a more holistic kind of science, a new kind of paradigm for nature. And meanwhile, um, the number of actual practicing scientists, doctors, and engineers who believe in scientism is not a majority, even in rather atheistic countries like Britain. We recently ran a survey, the Scientific and Medical Network, of which I'm a member, ran a survey conducted by a professional polling organization of scientists, engineers, and doctors in Britain, France, and Germany. About 25% are committed atheists, about 20% described themselves as agnostic. So about 45% said they were non religious, non spiritual. But about 45% said they were religious, spiritual but not religious, or religious and spiritual. So the number who were religious and spiritual was about the same as the number who were non religious, even in countries in Europe which are fairly atheistic and secular. And I'm sure if you did a poll like that in India or Pakistan or Brazil, you'd find that the percentage of atheists would be much lower. So, but even in Britain, they're not a majority. And Dawkins and his friends, although they make a lot of noise and speak loudly and get a lot of attention, don't represent the majority view within science. Those who don't agree with the materialist view, on the whole, keep quiet because they don't want to get into trouble or damage their career. Um, but when they have the courage to speak out, I think we'll find that the idea that the whole of science is dedicated to scientism and materialism is an illusion. It's simply not the case. And I think there are enough people within the sciences who are curious and open minded to bring about a change. How soon it will happen, be before it happens, I don't know. But I think we're on the old style dogmatic materialism, just can't go on that much longer, except through inertia.
No, absolutely, it can't. You mentioned the atheists in our part of the world, and well, in Pakistan and India, atheists, I mean, they don't have any scientific contributions apart from one thing, which is that they tell us that the atheist scientists have done really well. And that's it. So somehow they think they are better than me by telling me that somebody else has done a good work. that that's that. In the end, you've been very kind for giving time. In the end, I just like to mention one thing, and then we'll wrap whole thing up, and that is how I came across your work. Um, Dr. Sheldrake, have a problem. It's not strictly speaking insomnia, but I still struggle with sleep. It's not the case that I, just go to the bed and then I very soon find myself in the sleeping valley. It takes long time, in some cases hours, in some cases not always. So what I do is I put different sounds, different lectures, different type of um, sounds in my headband, and then try to get some help. So one day I was going through different videos, and that many years ago, and that was first time when I came across your video, and immediately I thought this is very ASMR grade articulation. This is going to put me to sleep straight away. It's only when I started listening to what you were saying, and I thought, not only this man is so eloquently articulate, he's actually saying things that I agree with. So I kept listening to you for one video and the second. So I wanted your help to go to sleep, but it has exact opposite effect. And since then, I've been listening to you 3 or 4 times a week, and I really thank you for my intellectual development. Has been learning a lot, and keep doing what you're doing, sir.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry if I'm contributing to your insomnia rather than curing it. Mm.
You're very kind. Thank you very much indeed. It has been an absolute pleasure and honor.
A pleasure to talk to you, Kaiser.